This video is part of a series on the misuse of statistical significance, and the topic for today is individuals aren't averages. So when you do a study and you look at statistical significance, what you're looking at is the average before and after. So you make some kind of change, or you have two different groups, and you're trying to see if the average between the two groups is different enough, if the change between the average is large enough. If it is, then you say it's statistically significant, and what you mean is that it's probably not due to random chance, it's probably due to the thing that you identified that was the difference between the two groups. So as an example, if you have some kind of product, what you might do is you might see how people do without the product and look at the average for how people do, and then you might give people the product and then see how they do after. And if there's a statistically significant improvement, what that means is that the average for the group after using the product was better than the average before using the product. So it's all about the average. And there's actually a problem with that because individuals aren't averages. The average might not represent any single individual. So maybe in some population, the average, the male to female average is 51% of people are males and 49% of people are females. So on average, 51% of people are male, but there's no 51% male individual as far as I know. Like, we're probably not talking about people who are 51% male. We probably have a lot of full male people and full female people, and it just averages out to 51%. So just because the average is 51%, that number doesn't actually apply to any single individual. And what's best on the average may also not apply to any single individual. So maybe, to continue on with that same example, well, 51% of the time, a male restroom is a better choice than a female restroom. So on the average, a male restroom would be better to have than a female restroom. But it wouldn't really make sense to only install male restrooms just because on the average they're better. That shouldn't sound correct to anyone, logically speaking. Like, that just doesn't make sense. Just because on the average it's better doesn't mean that it's better for every single individual out there. It depends on the individual. So that's kind of a silly example, but there's a lot more realistic examples that actually have a lot more meaning behind them. So I'm going to go through some hypothetical examples, and I really want to emphasize that this is just a possible scenario. I'm not saying this is the truth. I'm not saying that anything is actually exactly like this, like the example I'm giving, but it's a possibility. It's plausible that something could be like this, and if we don't investigate better, we aren't ruling out cases like these. So here's my first example. Let's say we have some certain vitamin, and again, this is not a reference to any specific real vitamin. This is just an example that's hypothetical. So we have some certain vitamin, and we do a study on it, and we show that for the people who take it, they have significantly longer lifespan, and they have better health in general. And we've done quality studies on it. They're studies that meet the gold standard. They're randomized controlled studies, and there's no problem with the studies done on them. And we find that there's a statistically significant benefit to taking the vitamin. So I have some questions about that. Well, does that mean that you as an individual can expect these benefits if you take the vitamin? And are you more likely to benefit from taking the vitamin than not? And should it be just recommended to everyone that everyone should take it? So what's the answer to those questions? Well, it's unclear. A study on statistical significance doesn't answer those questions. Because again, individuals aren't averages, so a lot of these questions are at an individual level, not an average level, not a general population level, and the results don't apply at that level. So let me give a possible scenario for how these results might have come to be. Let's say that some people are deficient in the vitamin, and for those people who are deficient, they get very large benefits if they take the vitamin. But a lot of people aren't deficient, and they actually get some minor problems, minor side effects, minor declines in health, actually, if they take the vitamin. And let's say that on the average in the population, 30% of people are deficient. And because the benefits are so large for the people who are deficient, it outweighs the small declines for the people who have enough of the vitamin. So, on average, the benefit greatly outweighs the declines. However, if we go back to our questions, we can now answer them because we know the reasoning behind how the results came to be. So, again, does this mean that you can expect these benefits if you take it? Well, no. You can only expect them if you're deficient, and you actually might be slightly harmed if you're not deficient. But on the other hand, if you are deficient, you can actually expect better benefits than the average improvement because you're going to be getting a larger benefit than the average. So if you look at this graph, that dotted blue line would be like an example of where the average might be if the black is the starting point for everyone. And then deficient people see a really large benefit, much more than the average improvement, but people who aren't deficient see a small decline. So again, you can't necessarily expect the benefits for yourself, and no one has, in this specific example, no one experiences the average change. Now for the second question, are you more likely to benefit from it than not? In this scenario, no, you're not. If you have no extra information to go off of, you're actually more likely to be harmed than you are to benefit. So even though we have a study that says it's a significant improvement, statistically significant improvement to lifespan and to health in general, that doesn't even mean that you're more likely to improve in your lifespan or your health as an individual. And that's the problem with trying to take the average result and apply it to an individual. It just doesn't work. Like in this case, you're more likely to be harmed than you are to benefit, even though there's nothing wrong with the study or the conclusion of the study. So what you really have to understand is, what does that conclusion actually mean? And then finally, should you recommend that everyone take this vitamin? Like, probably not. Like, you should probably work to try and find who's actually deficient and recommend that all those people take it, and not recommend that people who aren't deficient take it because it's actually harming them. So, again, I want to emphasize that this is not something that happens because a study is flawed or misleading. This study could be properly done, the results will be repeatable, and there's nothing wrong with the execution of the study. The problem is that the results don't tell us what we think they do. It's not saying that it's guaranteed to be good for everyone. It's not saying it's guaranteed to be more likely good for everyone than it is not. And again, this is not a reference to any real thing. This is not saying that any real thing is actually like this, but it could be, and a study doesn't rule it out. So let's look at another example. So let's say we do a study on hanging out with people you don't know, and when we do that study, we find that there's a significant increase in happiness for people who choose to hang out with people that they don't know regularly or in some way. So does this mean that you will be happier if you hang out with new people? Are you more likely to be happier than not if you do this? And should you recommend doing this for everyone? Well, again, it's unclear. A study on statistical significance doesn't answer those questions. Those questions are at an individual level, not an average level. So, no matter what conclusion the study gives, it doesn't really apply to these questions. So, for the way that the result might work out, the explanation as to why the results came out to be this way, one plausible scenario could be that extroverts tend to be happier when they hang out with unfamiliar people, but introverts introverts tend to be less happy when they hang out with unfamiliar people. But on the average, 60% of people are extroverts. And because there's more extroverts than introverts, on the average, overall, people are a little bit happier on average. But what does that mean? Does this mean that you will be happier as an individual if you hang out with new people? No, it's only true if you're an extrovert. And are you more likelier to be happy than not? Well, if you just considered yourself to be a completely random person that you knew nothing about, then you're slightly more likely to be happier than not. You have a 60% chance to be an extrovert. But if you actually know yourself, then you could answer that question in this scenario, and you would know whether or not it suits you, whether or not it's appropriate for you, whether or not it would make you happier. And so, should it be recommended to everyone? Well, probably not. It should probably only be recommended to people who would enjoy it. And that's not everyone. So, once again, just because the study shows that there's a significant improvement in happiness doesn't mean that any specific individual will necessarily be more happy by doing the thing that was studied. So let's look at another example. And once again, I want to keep saying it, but this isn't meant to point out anything specific. It's just a hypothetical example that could be possible, but a, a statistically significant study wouldn't rule out something like this. So let's say if you follow a certain diet or you do a study on a certain diet and then it's shown to significantly increase health when you do the study. So does this mean you're going to be healthier if you follow the diet? And are you more likely to be healthier than not? And should you recommend it to everyone? Well, as you can probably guess, it's still unclear because it's still not something that the study is designed to tell you. The study is, again, at an average level for the population and not at an individual level. So, one possible scenario behind the average result could be this one. It could be that the vast majority of people actually benefit. They're actually slightly better off. But for a very small percentage of people, they actually have some kind of rare condition, and when they do this diet, they actually experience serious problems. Maybe they get some problem with some organ or something starts failing on them, and it's actually really bad maybe for it. But it's only for a very small percent of people. Only a small percent of people have this condition. So let's say 5%. That's pretty small. So on the average, people are healthier, but that's kind of like a gamble. So are you going to be healthier if you follow the diet? Most likely, like 95%. Yeah, you're probably going to be healthier, but you're kind of gambling that you're not in the 5% if you don't actually know. So are you more likely to be healthier than not? Yes, you are in this case, But again, you're kind of gambling. You're like, you could get really unlucky and actually have some serious problems, but you are more likely than not to be healthier. And should it be recommended to everyone? Well, maybe, like, probably, kind of, but there's those 5% of people that are going to see some serious problems. But, like, it is beneficial for most people, so it's kind of hard to answer. Like you would be improving most people's lives, but there's that but there. So it's not really clear and it's hard to answer. But in order to even have the information you need to try and answer that, you have to understand the why. So that's the real thing I'm trying to get to here, is that the studies don't tell you why the average improved or like how the improvement was distributed. They just tell you that the average improved and it was probably not due to random chance. But there's a lot of different ways that average could improve, and I've gone through 3 different ones and I have one more example. But based on how that average improved, your answer to these questions is going to be different. And this isn't like, again, the study, there's nothing wrong with the study or how it was done. The conclusion is correct, but what's the takeaway from it? So for the final example, let's say that taking a certain medication is shown to significantly reduce the risk of dying from a heart attack. So does this mean that you will reduce your individual risk if you take the medication? And are you more likely than not to reduce your individual risk? And should it be recommended to everyone? Well, as with the other examples, it's still unclear. The results of a study like this don't answer those questions accurately. You need to know why the average changed that way. So, here's one scenario for why the average might have changed that way. Let's say for people with a certain genetic makeup, this medication actually drastically reduces the risk for those specific people. But for everyone else, it does nothing. And 5% of people have this certain genetic makeup and have the risk drastically reduced. But so, on average, people are a little bit better off. Like, the risk has been reduced by a little bit. So I'm using the right side of the graph to indicate better and the left side of the graph to indicate worse. So on average, things are slightly better. So, but does this mean that you will reduce your risk if you take the medication? Well, there's a high probability that no, you're not going to reduce your risk. Like 95% chance, you're not going to reduce your risk. Are you more likely than not to reduce your risk? It's the same answer. No, you're not more likely than not. There's 95% chance it's going to do nothing for you. And should you recommend it to everyone? Well, maybe. Because if it doesn't harm people, then maybe it's good. It's hard to answer though, because if it's something that's expensive, something that you have to pay for, is it really worth it? It's again kind of gambling. You're like hoping that you're one of those 5% of people that's going to see a big improvement, but you don't know if you are. You're just kind of gambling and maybe it's going to do nothing, which is okay. Like, at least it's not hurting you, but it's also not doing anything for you. So it's a bit of a hard question to answer. And for some of the previous examples, some of these things would be more obvious. Like, it would be pretty obvious if someone suffers a serious side effect based on something they did, or it'd be pretty obvious in some of the, like in the meeting new people case, if one group of people all say like it had a negative like a negative impact on their happiness and another group of people say it has a positive impact on their happiness, that would kind of be visible in the information you get from the study, but still, like, people don't tend to look at that information regardless. So even though it could be viewed, people don't look at it and they don't use it to make any decisions, even though arguably they should. But in a scenario like this, there's nothing that you can really look at. You would have to have known what the factors were yourself in advance. Like if you say, hey, I think there's a certain genetic factor that matters, so I'm going to separate the groups into people with this genetic factor and without this genetic factor and analyze that way. But you would have had to know in advance that that's how you want to break it up. And you want to break it up into those two groups. Because if you don't know, you're not going to be able to observe it. You're like, you can't measure the risk of dying or the risk of experiencing this kind of rare problem. The best you can do is observe the average. So you look at a large amount of people and see how many experience the problem. And if the truth was something like this, like 5% of people have a certain genetic makeup, and then this medication solves the problem for people with this genetic makeup, but does nothing for everyone else. If that's the actual truth of the scenario, you're not going to be able to see it in the study unless you just already knew or you already had an idea that that was what it was beforehand. Because again, you can't look at a person and see what their new risk is. You just have to look at the large group and see what the average is for the whole group. And you would have to then break out subgroups based on the factors you identified. So all of this is to say that the average is not a good measure for an individual. So it's important to understand that these types of studies on statistical significance, they look at the average change over a population, but that's not necessarily applicable to an individual. So uh, studies don't look at how the change in average is distributed. And again, like I was talking about with the previous example, um, that might be something that's really difficult to do. It's not like people are being lazy and not looking at the data. It's like it may be really hard to actually make the observation. It may be really hard to calculate the number or the change, and all you can really go off of is the average. But if that's all you can go off of, you should know what that means. And what that means is, what that doesn't mean is that any individual will experience the average change. So, as an individual, you don't know what kind of change you can expect for yourself, even if the average change is good. And again, no single individual may experience that average change as it's listed. So, with the vitamin example, there's maybe a small improvement on the average or a moderate improvement on the average, but no individual experiences that moderate improvement. Some individuals experience large improvement, and some individuals experience a bit of a decline. No individual experiences the average change in that specific scenario. So even though the study might come to a certain conclusion about the average change, no individual may necessarily experience that change. And this result is fine. Like, it's not a flawed method in the sense that it can produce a good big picture summary about something. So it's not like anything is wrong with the method, but people need to understand what the meaning is behind the conclusion of something like this. And the result doesn't apply to any individual. So the big bold point to take away here at the bottom is that you don't want to blindly apply average results to an individual. So average results don't apply at an individual level. As an individual, like whatever that average change might be, may not actually be what you experience as an individual, and it may not even be what you can expect to experience. And if the average change is good, that doesn't even mean that you're more likely to have a good change as an individual than you are to have a bad change. So, really, you do not want to blindly apply average results to individuals. And I know I've mentioned it multiple times already, but this is not the result of like a poor or flawed study. So a lot of times people will think it's due to the study being bad, that it's not a quality study, they didn't study enough people, or they didn't um, they didn't execute the study properly, or it's not repeatable, or people committed fraud or something like that, data fraud. But it's not anything like that. So you could have a high quality study that's well done, it's repeatable, there's no fraud at all, no bad intentions, no one's trying to be misleading. So everything is correct, but what's not correct is that how people try to apply the result. So I've said it many times already, but I think it's worth continuing to repeat that the study is going to give you an average result, but the average result shouldn't be applied to any single individual. You never want to take that average result and blindly apply it to people as individuals. All it is a big picture summary of something, and it might indicate something, or it might kind of be linked to something, but at an individual level, it's probably not a good idea to use an average change as an idea of what's going to happen for you as an individual. So this final bullet point is, what conclusion should you draw from the result? And it's tough to say,